Well, the idea for our fireside chats really came about when one of my very first years with CERIAS, and the keynote speakers came along with the CERIAS management team and ended up at Nine Irish Brothers. And the conversation at the table, and I was very new to cybersecurity at the time, was like, man, we should be recording this. Just the conversation amongst these people is as good as anything we just saw at the event. And so we decided we should do that. There is no script. We put four visionaries within the industry on the same platform here. We'll let them start to have conversation amongst themselves. And then we'll field questions from the audience. So all right, I'll work this side. Just raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you. But you've obviously just heard our first keynote. Our following two keynotes, which will be speaking tomorrow, are now on there. And the fireside chat will be moderated by our founder, Eugene Spafford. So, Spaff?
Okay, thank you. So, as Joel said, the intent here is to have some conversation. My role is to sort of prompt our speakers a little bit. So, if you want detailed bios, you can find them for our speakers on the agenda. Phil Venables, just spoken. And I'll mention one of the things, Phil has been involved with CERIAS for over 25 years. And we are going to link into his bio a report that he helped us write back in the early days, 25 years ago, that included a number of other luminaries of the time, including Howard Schmidt, Whit Diffie, Fred Piper, Dan Geer, Becky Bass. And so I would suggest you want to check that out. That's an interesting viewpoint. Second speaker, Kelley Misata, does a number of things, and you can see in the bio. But most notably, for those of you who are students, she graduated from here a number of years ago and is now up on stage. That's a place where all of you can aspire, and she's leading the industry. She's managed to work this in among a number of trips. And Michael Clothier is the CISO for Northrop Grumman Aero and Space, that very, very large organization with some interesting threats, has a 30-year career working in protecting various industries on multiple continents. And so we have a variety of views here, a lot of experience. And I'd like to kick this off in part by saying that one of the motivations for security certainly is to protect our assets against loss, right? We have that. We have international aspects and so on. But what drives a lot of people in caring about security is the issue of privacy. And in an era now where government is getting more intrusive, we're seeing some countries in Europe who are interested in putting backdoors in encryption. In the US, that's also come about. Marketers want more information. Privacy seems to be an afterthought. And so I'd be interested in each of you perhaps addressing that a little bit as an aspect of security. And Phil will give you a little bit of a break because you just talked. So Mike, would you like to start on this?
Sure, no problems. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Let's make sure. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I mean, so I'm the CISO for the AS sector, so the Aeronautics Systems sector. So here on behalf of Phyllis, Dr. Phyllis Neck, she's the CISO for the corporation. With regards to privacy, we're fortunate enough that we actually have a privacy office, and their dedicated purpose and mission is exactly that, looking at really, the threats externally, the regulations, the rules. We operate on many countries and many continents, and so there's also the international aspects of what the respective countries and regions have as far as their rules and requirements and regulations as well. We have to look at that in regards to the cybersecurity piece is what does that mean as far as what security controls we have to put in place, whether it be data encryption, whether it be a least privilege approach. But it's really about making sure, I just see it as another aspect or dimension to, risk mitigation, ensuring the protection of data, so only the appropriate people have access to what they should, and making sure that people, in the company as well are also aware of what their protections are, their rights. And it's important, we have some training on that as well, but to identify if there is some kind of breach or compromise, there also has to be, methods and checks and procedures in place to also, not only to safeguard it, but also on the back end of that, if there is some kind of, unauthorized access or undisclosed access, that we have the appropriate things in place to follow that up.
Kelley?
I'm going to come at it from a completely, whoops. Hopefully, can you all hear me now? Okay, great. I'm going to come out from a completely different angle. So my background is in nonprofits as well as open source software development. And I started my career, part of my security career, much to the displeasure of some, at the Tor project. And I'm sure many of you have heard about Tor over the decades. Privacy is defined very differently when you are working in those sorts of mental models of people in certain situations, people with certain sort of ideologies. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in security is that privacy is not something you can define, because it's individual. You can talk about it in terms of systems, you can talk about it in terms of trends of behavior, but you can't say your privacy is the same as mine, it's the same as yours. We have to sort of think about the complexity of this issue in concert with the security controls. We can't just say, oh, we're going to define it for our organization and be done, because it is very, very complex.
Yeah, and I think just kind of building on all of that, one of the things obviously across Google, when you think about everything that we do, supporting billions of people, is ultimately it's about making sure that people have control over their privacy. I think you're right, is often privacy sometimes is at its worst when people are surprised by something, even if otherwise they would have configured the product to share some information to give some benefit to them. Ultimately, people like to feel like they have control. I think there's also a lot of places where and many other companies have been able to do some quite significant technology advances that lets us achieve privacy goals in ways that complement security and other goals. So again, many of you may be familiar with with things like privacy enhancing technologies like differential privacy. We're doing a lot of things on confidential compute and enclaves around how you can process information in ways that are under user control on their devices, where we're provably able to get signal back about the usage of a service without compromising privacy, so that service can be secured and protected. So there's lots of this is probably one of the most fruitful areas of security and privacy research, where we're dependent on academic institutions like this and others to drive this research to let us deliver what people want in ways that support their privacy goals, while getting enough signal to be able to defend the environments they run in. It's quite a complex trade-off.
And let me expand on this a little bit, in the sense that if we support privacy to the extent that some people want to, we at the same time are limiting our ability to have visibility into the criminal actors, and not simply just criminals, but we have organizational and even governmental misbehavior. Fraud, waste, and abuse is a popular term by some people, even if they're committing it. And so what we want to do is have a mechanism to have feedback and be able to have observability, yet support the security and privacy. This is an ongoing challenge. What do you see as the potential direction of this? We've depended in part on governments to have some role, and yet they're also the ones that sometimes are committing the misbehavior. So Is there a solution that we're headed towards? Do you see something there? Any of you care to?
Again, I think that this problem is so complex because what we're running up against is we're running it up against a population of people who are throwing their hands up in the air, saying, "Oh, my data's all out there, my private." There is no such thing as privacy. And you've got the other side. So you've got some folks across the ocean that are drilling down into, I get to protect my data. I get to protect my privacy, and the government supports that. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for us as a security field to be able to put in these mechanisms. But I think it's exciting for us to start figuring out in a way where we can help end users not just throw their hands up anymore. Because I think that's the biggest concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on something important there as well, which I think is I think we have to be more specific about what the goals are. And this is the problem, is you're right, is, we can say things like resilience, privacy, all of these things you got to go to a level below. And I'll give you an example. So, sometimes, for example, our friends and colleagues in the European Union express certain goals as privacy goals. But then when you kind of dig into it, some of those goals are actually sovereignty goals. In other words, they want the data of their national citizens and their critical services to be kept within their geographic boundaries, and that for that data to not be accessible even under legal means by other countries. So that's sometimes described as a privacy thing, but it's more than that. It's a sovereignty thing. So when you express it like that, you can actually build a solution for that. And we actually did build a solution for that. It's something we call Trusted Partner Cloud, or also called Sovereign Cloud. So for example, in France, we have this partnership with Thales, a French national IT company, where we have cloud regions that are cryptographically isolated, and that provider manages the root of trust for that cloud region in that country. And so it gives provable isolation to achieve that sovereignty goal. Now you can do that because you express it as a very specific problem. And I think, one of the things I think we have to do for all of our security, privacy, reliability, risk, resilience, we have to just go to the level below and actually specify it as a goal that can be engineered and achieved. And that's where the work is.
Yeah, just one thing to add. I mean, I think Phil mentioned it. I don't think privacy is necessarily just something you can put in a box and say, how do we solve this piece? It is very complex and it is challenging. As much as technology is intertwined with cybersecurity, I think some of those overlaps exist with the whole privacy piece and probably even the sovereignty piece as well, when you talk about all the different multinationals in the different regions. I mean, certainly I've seen that in my current role at Northrop, previous roles that I've had other parts of the world. Certainly, I think sovereignty is definitely a major challenge when it comes to when you have a global footprint, you want to share data and things like that. How do you keep that? How do you follow all the appropriate countries and like regions, EU, for example? How do you follow all of their rules, laws, etc., and then balance that on the individual and personal, kind of understanding perspectives and requirements as well. So, I mean, to your point, Spaff, I think it's a challenge. I mean, the main thing that we can do is at least at a bare minimum follow all the rules, regulations, guidance, industry standard. We work a lot with our partners. We collaborate. We understand what people are doing in other businesses and even other sectors to see how we can best, adapt, adopt, and try and just have the best balance of all of those factors at one time.
Well, certainly working as well in space, we have no visible borders in many ways.
Yeah.
I think back to the original sort of statement John Perry Barlow put forward about there's no borders in cyberspace and how we have the ability to build something new. And many of us ideologically thought about this shared resource that the global population can have access to learn and to build on. And yet we're seeing increasingly greater imposition of, as you said, sovereignty of national intent on what can be done and what can't be done. A term that I've seen used as the balkanization of the internet. And I would be interested in your perspectives, given these trends, given some of the difficulty in bringing to justice, as it were, some of the people who are abusing the systems. We're, if you look in historical, perhaps we're at a point where we built bigger castle walls and we were working harder to defend ourselves, to repel attack, rather than to change the environment for those who would attack. And given that trend, we have that balkanization, that push more towards defense. I'd be interested in your thoughts, each of you, on where are we evolving to? What are we going to do eventually here to try to deal with this situation? So whoever would like to tackle that poorly worded question.
This is why we need some Irish whiskey to help this situation.
Next fireside, Joel.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give it a shot. I mean, I think, I mean, I think national goals to create their own kind of isolated environments for various reasons. I mean, I think, you know, do create that inevitability. I mean, I think there is, you know, there's the base layer of kind of internet connectivity, of which some countries isolate, then there's some countries that restrict various services, and then there's some countries that want to isolate and localize things. I think that's just an inevitability that is going to continue. I think that's, you know, when you look at, I'm always a believer, if you just look at incentives, you know, the incentives of particular governments and particular politics is just to keep going down that path. And one of the things that is good, though, is I do see a lot of collaboration and cooperation across many countries, even countries that on the face of it are not particularly collaborative, to defeat, for example, international organized crime, both in cyber and in non-cyber. I think there's a lot of cooperation there. I think the other thing as well is there's a lot of work imposing costs on attackers. Again, I always like to say attackers have bosses and budgets just like the rest of us. They can respond to incentives. You know, they literally, you know, if you can make life harder for them, they'll move on to an easier target. If you can, you know, sometimes people joke where the law enforcement has put indictments around, you know, kind of Russian hackers, and you think, well, it's not like we're going to go in and arrest them. Well, you know, no. But it does limit their ability to turn up to a place and have a holiday in a place where there's an extradition treaty. And that kind of, you know, it impacts their ability to interact with bigger parts of the banking system. It like really, you know, causes them to second guess what they do. So I think despite all of that, I think we have and can keep doing more to impose costs on attackers. But just like crime's been with us for, you know, since the dawn of humanity. It's going to keep changing, and we're going to keep evolving, and I think that's just inevitable.
Yeah, I think just playing on that, I remember like the first time I got introduced to what Tor was and that community and everything. The thing that has always stuck with me was statements around, you know, the bad guys are all using these tools. The bad guys want to protect their privacy. They care about their privacy. They care about their security. And if you sort of flip the lid a little bit and say, okay, we're building all these amazing systems and tools to protect ourselves, but the bad guys are also doing the same. So how are we going to keep them, you know, bring them to justice, kind of bring them to seeing the error of their ways or whatever it is, with the same tools that we're using to protect ourselves? So it's incredibly, like, it makes my head hurt to think about, like, how do we build these and create systems of enormous security and privacy, particularly at the nation state level, when we've got attackers mimicking what we're doing over here in their environment? Where are we going to find the middle? It's going to be incredibly challenging. We have to get smarter at it, maybe. Think like more bad guys. I took a course here, though, not to digress for 1 second. I did take a class in my PhD program, which I absolutely loved. I think it was cyber terrorism, and Sam Lyles, Dr. Sam Lyles taught it, and it was absolutely fascinating because first half of the semester, we were all given countries. In the first half, you had to defend the country against a certain event. the second half of the semester, you had to be an attacker. And it was such an amazing experience as a security student and professional to say, I have to think in both lanes all the time. And you don't always come to an answer. So I think if we can keep moving forward, but keeping in both lanes, we might do ourselves a favor.
Sure. I mean, to build on that, just to answer that more broadly as far as how to deal with attackers, not necessarily just from a maybe privacy perspective, but just more broadly, I think the taking a very proactive approach is the best way to kind of mitigate a lot of that risk. And I know that we focus very much on ensuring the best defense capabilities possible. We have a lot of systems in place, a lot of capabilities. We branch out to government, to our sector competimates, as we call them. We have a very collaborative joint approach in safeguarding, data safeguarding our systems. And we also perform some of those proactive kind of hunter-seeker internal assessments. So we have teams that will actually be simulating, attackers, if you will, or trying to be, us as a target. They want to be taking our data, whether it be for privacy or other means. And we will have teams that will be proactively doing this. Maybe even use of third parties to come in and do it. We also run internal simulators as well, where we have scenarios and we work it through with different executives, different working groups, and people that aren't familiar with cybersecurity, because it's really a business problem more so than a technology problem if you have some kind of data breach or compromise, or somebody's just trying to even gain unprivileged access. So we run through a lot of scenarios with the business to make sure that we have all the appropriate procedures and steps in place, that if there was some kind of event, that would be best prepared to deal with that. So really just trying that proactive approach from a defense, and then also a response if there is some kind of thing, I think is the best way we can really kind of safeguard data in general.
Well, I'm going to throw out a little bit more to follow on this, and we'll also go out here to the audience if there's questions. But one of the aspects about the domain we work in that's different from the physical domain is the concern over the flow of ideas, really, which can be represented in lots of ways. That we have restrictions on the flow of, for instance, information, how to build space launch or nuclear weapons or financial information or other kinds of data. Privacy, that's an aspect where we're concerned about the flow of information about people's medical records or images of them. And the toleration, as several of you pointed out, is different in different environments as to what's allowable to be shared or what's demanded to be shared. The whole notion of this is, however, if the information is out there, there's not really a way to reclaim it. So there is a kind of an entropy that we have going on, where this information eventually is all going to be out there, that we're fighting against it, and we're fighting against human nature. But we also have the case where there's pollution. A lot of parties are purposely putting false information out there, and it takes root. So conspiracy theories, disinformation. An example, for instance, is the misinformation about vaccines being more harmful than helpful, or even flat Earth, or the aliens amongst us, which may be the case when you meet some of our faculty. But I guess the question is that's a higher level problem that has more to do with our protection than building firewalls or antivirus or response drills. And I'd be interested in your take on this as professionals in this field. Is there a way for us to deal with this information pollution, containment, spread kinds of issues? That's a large scope, but it's to give you room to riff on that as you wish.
I think it comes down to truth. It's very hard to discern what is truth and what is fiction with some of the data out there, right? So how do we build systems to be able to determine that, where the truth lies? Because the truth is ultimately, to I think the question that you're asking is what we want to protect. The data that's true, something that hasn't been compromised, protecting the integrity of that data, which we talk about from the moment, a student walks into a cybersecurity program, we talk about data integrity, but how do we verify that it is what we think it is? Because I think we're getting ourselves in this weird loop of always questioning. Is that true? Is that not true? Like, how many things did you all read on your social media feeds this morning or in the news, and you questioned like instantaneously, like, what? Is that real? That can't be real.
But we also don't question some things enough, like some of the hallucinations with AI systems.
Yeah.
So
Well, look, I'm not going to open a political can of worms, but I think we've got to be careful, because I'm sat here in a scientific institution, and the whole scientific method is to constantly question the things that were previously accepted as truth, that sometimes are then invalidated for legitimate reasons or enhanced. And I think, we got to be careful of just having this kind of, trying to get to a world where, some algorithm or some technique is going to differentiate between something being true or not true. The reality is there's a spectrum of all things. You look at, some of the medical debates, some of the geopolitical debates, they're, depending on your perspective, they could be true or not. I mean, I kind of, again, this is not a political statement, it's just a statement, is every time, not just AI hallucinations, but I read a lot of stuff online from legitimate sources that I know, when I know something about that subject, I'm half the time I'm like, that's not true, whereas if it's something I don't know about, I go, well, that's from a legitimate source, it must be true. And I kind of learned this in various different industries and worked in various different companies, having intimate, close-hand knowledge of the reality and seeing it represented by a so-called source of truth as being actually completely inaccurate and misrepresented. So I think we've got to be careful about seeking algorithmic solutions to what is ultimately a problem where all of us need to just be better at critical thinking and understanding the fact that the information we're getting, no matter how legitimate the source of truth is, will come with a perspective and a filter that is not necessarily malicious, but it just has a perspective. And I think we've just got to get better at weighing all that up.
Mike, you have anything to add?
Well, I just look at it from the perspective of what is it that I can do, either personally or in my role. And the biggest part that I can do in that is really to ensure that the data that I am controlling or that I do have responsibility over does have that integrity, and it is, truthful if referenced and things like that. So I just look at it more from what can I actually do in my role. So it's really about, and that comes down to some of the cybersecurity, tenets of making sure that the data's, has integrity. So I think that's really the piece that I can focus on in this broader, discussion.
I'm coming at this from the aspect of philosophy more than anything.
Understood.
In that, what is truth, or, what is accurate with time is similar to what is privacy with time, changes. And as security professionals, sometimes we're very much caught up in the controls, as you were talking about, that this is what defines what we're doing, rather than underlying values questions about what is it that we're really protecting.
Well, and I think, again, this comes back to, we've got to be careful, especially in the industry we're in, to be precise about the problem we're solving. So, for example, image authenticity. You can actually say, we have controls that are able to show that an image is genuine and was sourced from a sensor in a camera held by a legitimate, journalist organization. That could be authentic, but it could be represented in a different context that could, in effect, be some misinformation or disinformation. but it doesn't change the fact that the image is authentic. So I think we've got to be careful. And again, I'm kind of coming back at you with philosophy is we just got to be, we've got to get better at framing the questions. Because often in whether it's this or the privacy discussion we just had, where we get into trouble as a community, as a profession, as a society, is when we start coming up with solutions to the wrong problem because we didn't define the problem well enough.
Well, and I'll just sort of go on to that because the image is authentic by a product of the device,
Yep.
not the person taking the image, right?
Exactly.
Because it could be you, could be me.
Yep.
So it boils down to, in many cases, our biggest problem in our field is us. It's the people. We're messy. We're a complete pain in the neck. We break things. We don't do what we're supposed to. We go outside the lines all the time. We create systems that have flaws, right? So we are always going to be battling the evolution of the human brain and our society and our behaviors as we're fighting against these systems that we're trying to build to protect ourselves. And that's not to sound fatalistic. I'm actually quite hopeful because I see, evolution in human behavior, even in the decade I've been in security. And it's great. We're not there yet, but I certainly don't feel fatalistic about it either.
I'm actually quite excited and optimistic about the future, despite all the challenges, because I think, when you look at different generations, how they use technology, they're kind of innovating in the ways that are kind of not only coping with the technology, but coming up with ways to use it in trustful ways, despite all the pressures. So I think, we'll figure this out. But, even, the interesting thing is, you just look at what's coming in the next few years. Like, I don't know, just imagine a future in 5 years' time where we're wearing kind of augmented reality glasses and we're all sitting with a different overlay of reality compared to each other. Like, imagine having this discussion in 5 years' time in that situation.
Well, in 5 years' time, maybe everyone on stage won't be on stage. It'll be AIs debating with each other. So if we've met the problem and the problem is us, perhaps we have started down the road of creating a solution to it. Don't know.
But I think sorry.
No.
I think the generations are also going to be teaching us, to Phil's point. How many of you have teenagers or college age students? Right. I'm now an empty nester. Can't believe it. Ask your kids how they define privacy. They'll look at you like, what's that? Right? So I think we also have to.
Yeah, why wouldn't I open up Find My Friends to everybody?
Yeah.
all the pins in their phone. They're like, oh, I could see this person go there. And for them, that gives them actually confidence and security, knowing where their friends are. Just as one very small example. But looking at the generations of what's coming, behind us, it's like, oh, maybe that's where some of these new ideas will come from. Because it's not, I remember interoffice mail. I know many of you in this room remember interoffice mail. Talk about privacy concerns. You could see on the mail thing, it went to HR and then it went to the president and then went to this department. Somebody's getting fired, right? So I don't want to design systems and think about security from my vantage point. I want to think about it from the generations that are coming up, but we need them in the conversation to be able to help frame those ideas.
Is there anyone in the audience with a question or comment you'd like the panel to respond to?
Kelley, first a comment for you. Years ago, Mike Atala, one of the other founders of CERIAS, had said, everybody says privacy is important until you offer them a $5 coupon to give you all of their information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
How many of you have read the terms of service or terms of use in the apps that are on your phone?
Yeah. Sure.
So sometimes companies do bolt-on security instead of baking it in. For example, in the case of a large-scale acquisition. So I was going to ask Phil, maybe, were you part of the Wiz acquisition? What did you get for your $32 billion? And what are some of the challenges to integrating that technology into a large-scale enterprise?
Yeah, so we can't actually talk about that, not because I'm being evasive, but like rules, yeah, there's a quiet period between deal announcement and deal close. So I'm not trying to be too evasive, but one of the things I would say is, like most organizations, we realize that most of our customers live in these multi-cloud environments. So there's almost no organizations that use a single cloud or a single technology. There multiple clouds, multiple SaaS providers, multiple on-premise environments. And so, the logic of the Wiz acquisition is to, further our ability to meet customers where they are and help them manage multi-cloud workloads. And so, the whole reason for the thing is to be multi-cloud and to continue to support that across multiple clouds. And we think tying that with some of the other multi-cloud technology we've got is a pretty strong case.
There's one in the back there.
Okay. Hello. Oh, sorry.
Up front first.
I'm Pranav Thermal. I couldn't help but interject when y'all were talking about the younger generation, because I consider that myself part of that. And specifically when it came to how even legitimate news sources can have some sort of perspective to them, even if the facts themselves are correct. As the founder and sole developer of UpToDate, it's an app on the Play Store. My solution was that I wanted my users to see a collection of news articles, and then from there that can act as a sieve so that you generate the actual facts for yourself using critical thinking. Now beyond that, my actual question, that was just a thought of mine. My actual question was, as a founder myself of a small user base, I was wondering how I can implement security in my application when I don't have the large scale that big companies do. My infrastructure is all on cloud because I'm not running a server. I'm not running a server farm, obviously. So I was wondering how I can implement trust in my users and implement privacy and security while also making it something that's affordable for me as a sole developer.
I'll kick off, and I would, I think in many cases, try and stick with the defaults as much as possible. So I think all cloud providers, I wouldn't say any of us are perfect yet, but all cloud providers are trying to make the default configurations of most products more and more secure to get a lot more opinionated about what we want organizations to do. And so I think, if you're taking the standard secure defaults, or if there's an option to go switch on all controls and hit that button, and I think, and generally just take all of the updates that come back to that kind of digital immune system point I was talking about. Every time we implement hundreds of new features every quarter on security. A lot of them either come from our own ideas about how to do things, but a lot of them will come from having seen a bad thing happen somewhere else that needs that update. So just kind of use the strong defaults and take every update you get from your cloud provider.
And then communicate to your users. Be clear with your users what is set as the default, and what they need to act on. I think if we communicate better to our end users, we will go further.
And just an observation as well. I mean, you're obviously not the first person that's trying to do this. So there's going to be many other examples, right? So I would also suggest us to search for how other people have approached the same challenges that you're facing. And also just something I've found that usually increased security, posture may impact functionality sometimes. Sometimes they're fundamentally opposed to each other. So sometimes it can be a balance rather than just putting the slider all the way to the right, and it's the most secure lockdown, right? Like, privacy and integrity kind of setting. You may find that as a result of that, there's certain functionality and things that won't work. So sometimes you have to kind of figure out where you want to be on that slider to have the best, security boundaries, if you will, frameworks and things, but still allow the functionality that you want. And that can be an ongoing, continual kind of battle too. So as things evolve, publicly, that may be something that you have to continually revisit and update. and adjust accordingly to meet, the current demands.
To build on some of the comments that we had earlier, that providing security is ill-defined. What you need to do is be clear to your user base what it is you are providing and what it is they need to do to protect themselves above and beyond that. Because you can't provide everything. As Michael said, you can't move the slider all the way to one side, then you don't have the capabilities that you're trying to put in place. And if you don't have the deep resources that a large organization has to provide it, what you can do, however, is to state to your users, your customers, your business partners, whomever, what it is you are doing and how you're going to keep that up to date. And then it's up to them to decide, well, are they going to do business with you? Or are they going to employ their own mechanisms? Are they going to ask you for something else, demand you something else, or pay you for something else? So those are all issues that are based on the communications to set up.
And trust them. I think a lot of companies love app developers and software developers, think that users won't want to do, the next step to protect themselves, but I think we're shifting. So trust that your users will want to keep themselves secure.
Yeah, in the sense, we don't know a lot more than some of our users. We know some, perhaps, and don't want to generalize too much there, but there is that element of trusting. So I recognize Jennifer. Hello, welcome.
Thank you, Scott. In the context of Phil's question, our discussion on automation, he was talking about having specifications for goals and having worked with cloud service providers to meet these specifications. And I have been constantly surprised by the lack of a basic ability to audit a service provider because they don't even allow their customers to export the configuration that they have put in the security of some product. Even security products, often you cannot see how you configured it without specially requesting something from your personalized support person. So in the absence of standards, that would apply to any cloud provider, it's very difficult for customers to demand these types of features that would allow them to have metrics on clouds. So is there anything on the horizon that you see that would give us those, that kind of leverage where there is a standard, exception MFA? Almost everybody now says you can have MFA if you configure it and you can tell if it's there. But that's my example of the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very timely question, and I agree with your perspective on this. I've spent most of my career not in a cloud provider, being the victim of various cloud providers, and there's a reason I came to Google, because that was the most pleasant experience of the cloud providers I got to deal with. And so I can't speak for the other cloud providers, but I know what we're doing, and so we're doing a lot of things in response to where you're going with this. And so we do permit customers now to export their configurations. In fact, weirdly, the first driver for this was on cybersecurity insurance. So we partnered with Munich Re and Allianz, where we have a product called Risk Manager, where customers can export their configuration to their cybersecurity insurance company to enable them to demonstrate their configuration as being sufficiently secure that they should get a discounted insurance policy. And we've kind of built on a lot of that. The other thing that we do is there's a standard from NIST called OSCAL, which many of you will be familiar with, Open Standards Control Assessment Language. And it's a machine-readable way of specifying controls and whether you've configured them. We're actually doing a few things. So we now, for some of our systems, like the Department of Defense, for example, require continuous export of OSCAL format data to represent controls to permit ongoing FedRAMP and other validation. So we've been doing that. And then we've also got a partnership with the Cloud Security Alliance on a thing called continuous auditing and something, which is basically how should all cloud providers encode their controls to emit them in OSCAL standard format to let customers ingest those control attestations in machine-readable ways. So I think we're going down that path in some cases, where cajoling our colleagues in some of the other providers to get there. I wouldn't say we're anywhere where we'd really like to be, but we're on the path of getting to where we want to be. Now there's also I know you know, Jennifer, there's a different level of abstraction below this. So, there's the configuration of products that customers use, and then there's the underlying infrastructure substrate that cloud providers have that serve those customer environments. We're increasingly opening all of that up to third-party validation, not just kind of audit checklist validation, but actual like analysis and attestation at a lower level as well. And that's something that we're doing more of as well. But your point's exactly right. And I think we have to get there, even quicker than we're trying to get there now.
Yeah, I think attestation we're back to truth again.
Yep.
Do you want to go first? Such great questions, I was like, which one to pick, but going back to the truth one, a little bit on the education piece that you mentioned, Kelley. I think it is not as obvious as you would think on some very standard truths. So going back to the ethics and values, and I see my kids in online classes, and it's jaw-dropping, the kind of, sometimes I feel as if there's a little bit of that brainwashing, and like the ability to do critical thinking is very important. But my question, because we have really experienced folks and students who are going to be the new, cybersecurity community, what can we do to build, there's no single source of truth, but how do we build a system that has improved, like more trustworthy information that people can count on?
I've got no thing. I don't think I have a particularly kind of great insight into this, but the one thing I will say is, on some of the social media platforms, these kind of, readers' notes or these kind of community notes type things where the platform itself is not trying to be an arbiter of truth, but the community itself, it's a bit like kind of Wikipedia editing processes or community notes, all these. I think, I'm sure there's probably studies that would refute everything I'm just saying, but those seem to like intuitively work quite well, where the community kind of protects itself. Now, again, as you'll probably know, you can always find edge cases where that's failed fundamentally. But generally speaking, I actually think that's, there's a lot more to be done on these community-driven processes. Now, again, there'll be ways of manipulating that. There are ways of manipulating that. There's kind of key person dependencies that can act as a lever to influence the whole. But generally speaking, I think there's some promise there.
But this is one of the beautiful things of CERIAS, I have to say, this symposium. When you're sitting up here and you hear a voice in the back of the room who you recognize, hi, Abhilasha, how are you? We've been serving on RSA program committee together in the same track, so I've been hearing her voice on calls, and it's great to see you. I think to answer your question maybe in a little bit of different ways, that we need to talk more about the skill of critical thinking and not assume that's inherent, and not assume that everybody's going to be able to do it out of the gate. What I love when I am talking to Gen Cyber folks and other young up-and-coming cybersecurity professionals is the power of taking a pause. Just take a moment. Like if you are looking at something, if you're reading something, if you're interacting with technology, take a pause. Not everything has to be like this all the time. We've got a lot of that with the machines around us, which is wonderful and exciting. But for us as human beings, we can take a breath to think about what we're doing and move forward. And I try and teach that with my daughters, who are so interested in consuming everything around them. Like, take a pause and let's unpack it a little bit, not to use buzzy words, but take a moment.
I had just a quick follow-up for one of Phil's previous responses. Do you know the number, the NIST standard you cited?
I don't, but it's OSCAL, OSCAL.
Oh.
If you just Google NIST OSCAL, it's like
Okay.
probably more information than you ever want to read about it.
Probably.
That's what NIST standards generally are.
Yeah.
Very exact. There's one in the back there.
Before we get there. Emerging threats, things that you've seen that scare you or think that's going to be most concerning that we're not already talking about.
I can start off just for the world that I live in, just the skill or the advancements in, our adversaries. They are incredibly well funded and resourced and very smart. So that's a continuing, ongoing, challenge. And it's easier to protect against or safeguard against things that you know and you're aware of. I would say they're the easy ones, but you have to anticipate as much as you can and try and look forward to really try and understand what may be the new threat vectors, new angles and things like that. And it's obviously a very challenging, very large space to be in. We're certainly under a lot of observation and from, we have a lot of data that many people would like. So, I think it's really to be as proactive as you can and try and understand, those, like you said before, some of the question about the emerging threats to see how they could be used against you and try and build as many safeguards and capabilities in place. And then the IR piece, the response to that if something does eventuate itself.
I think from my perspective, so I live in the world of nonprofits, is that we have, 2 million nonprofits just in the United States alone. And many of those organizations are serving not only needy communities, but are there when a disaster hits. And those are organizations that if they're not ready when we need them, it's going to be hugely impactful. So we need to start thinking, sorry to beat the horse that Spafford's heard me beat for 10 years, but we need to think about the nonprofit sector as a viable, not only business opportunity for security solutions, but we need to start thinking about them as another layer of infrastructure that can't be ignored by the security space, because we need these organizations to serve our community.
Well, let me step that up a little bit because 2 years ago, Wendy Mather was here giving a keynote. She was talking about the security poverty line. And it goes with this, that perhaps the threat we're not thinking about is pushing everything into the commercialization aspect,
Right.
and pricing out many of the parties that really need to be having access to that to be able to protect themselves. And we don't, to go what you were saying, we don't have an inventory. We don't really know where all of those critical nodes are. If we're not protecting them, we're potentially going to have a problem. So back in the other time zone there, I think we had a question way in the back. Did we have somebody with a mic?
Yeah, so this question is for Dr. Misata and maybe Mr. Venables, because I know Google's Summer of Code is coming up soon. So it's on open source, and how exactly do you balance the spirit of like open source development with open code and open data just being all out there with the requirements of security?
You mind if I kick off? It's a wonderful, wonderful question. And I love, again, I don't know why I sort of find myself in this happy split space of loving the complexity of things. So I've been in open source for 12 years. And the thing that's really interesting to me as we look around security and making sure that open source sort of holds those tenets going forward is that oftentimes people forget that open source is a development model, right? It's software development. There are all these other elements circling around the open source software that's being developed. That's a development model, right? And so we have to look at open source in a much, much broader aspect than just the code. So at OISF, we build Suricata. Do any of you use Suricata, by the way? You should all be nodding your head yes if you deal with network security. And those who did, you get a sticker. I've got some in my bag. But I talk to large organizations that are using open source in many, many critical infrastructures around the world. And a lot of them don't understand how OISF operates. Who is our lead developer? What is our governance structure? What is our QA process? What is our release cadence? What is our end of life policy? So I think for us to start thinking about how to secure open source, we've got to widen our thinking around it beyond just developing software.
No, I agree, and in fact, you know, it's again one of the reasons we helped co-found the Open Source Security Foundation a few years ago was exactly that problem is just making sure that the open source community, of which we're a big part of, whether it's kind of Linux maintenance, Kubernetes, all of the other open source projects, and actually a lot of our hardware projects we push to be open source so they can get the right scrutiny and support, is just kind of equipping open source maintainers and consumers of open source with the end-to-end tooling that enables them to keep things up to date, to keep things managed. One of the things that kind of drove me nuts, some of you may remember during the Log4j vulnerability a few years ago, this was a vulnerability that was affecting quite a lot of organizations around the world that had used this particular package. It was maintained by just a small number of people. And you had these large corporations like sending these these to the guys that maintain this project, sending them like big vendor questionnaires saying, you must commit to keep these things, and total misunderstanding of how the open source community runs. And one of the things we'd said to a lot of these big corporations, like, will you stop doing that and just join the Open Source Security Foundation with us and others and help us fund tools for these developers? And so we focused a lot on giving some of our tooling, giving grants to enable developers of open source projects to kind of meet their SALSA compliance and SBOM compliance, all these other things that then lets organizations that consume it in the right way use it. And so I think it is a thing. My favorite kind of hobby to annoy large corporations is, being in kind of similar rooms like this, but in industry, just saying how many people care about open source security, and everyone goes, of course we care about it. And then how many have actually spent the, I don't know, 10K or 50K a year to join the Open Source Security Foundation, like zip. And one of the things and then after the meeting, they all sign up for it after I've annoyed them.
So, Michael, I'm going to pivot a little bit here to you on this, because you are working particularly in a sector that not only security and reliability, but safety is a big issue. And open source is often even more of a problem in the safety community, real time, some other kind of issues. From that perspective, and what you do you have some comments there about open source?
Just to clarify the safety piece, what do you mean exactly from
if something is going to fail,
right,
it's not going to fail catastrophically, that we have alternatives, that we have if you've got a plane and suddenly the control system stops working, that's a bad sign. That's a bad day. Yeah.
Understood. It would be. I just need to be careful how far I go with answering this question, but I'll keep it generic to the extent that any of our open source software that we use, and we do use quite extensively, because there's obviously some considerable advantage with that. We do have initially, before something even comes into the organization, we do have an APL process, an approved products list. There's a process where every open source software is rigorously tested and evaluated to understand if there are any inherent risks, any threats, anything that we need to mitigate. And we look for as robust, packages and things that we can in the first place. And it's a continual ongoing evaluation of that software once it's also in the workplace. And additionally, whenever there are newer updates and newer versions to the open source software, we're also looking to see if they are an improvement in security posture and an improvement in capabilities, so that when we are using those, we're kind of already before, right? You're further down the road where you've done all this extensive development and something becomes hard to maybe port across or upgrade. We're already using the best capabilities that we can. Part of the other kind of ethos that we try and bake into all that is that piece of software that we're using, we don't want it to be so hard coded or so well written or so thorough to that version or to that capability that it doesn't ever, it cannot be upgraded. You talk about some of the legacy systems and things before. you want them to be from a good perspective, right? That they are, robust and they are maintained and things. They're not something that does cease support, and then you've got a massive challenge to try and upgrade that piece. So a continual upgrade process and things really helps to make sure that we're using the best of breed open source, but there is that kind of capability to continue to update to the latest versions.
I think those of you out in the audience that are thinking about developing or contributing to open source need to keep this perspective in mind, that if it's really going to be used, there's a whole lot around that process that has to go on. Some of the original view of talking about open source, the many eyes make bugs shallow, isn't really true. That in fact, studies of open source programmers indicate that many of them would rather chew off their own arms than to do security audits. And the whole aspect of documentation and evolution is kind of foreign to the people who just want to create code. That's one kind of open source, but that's not the kind that we're going to be building larger infrastructure or other kinds of issues on, because there are issues of reliability, safety, documentation, and other kinds of things that often aren't even taught in places where we're talking about building open source. So I think that's a great question.
It's about doing your research. Lots of organizations that I've seen come to OSF after the fact, which is interesting to me. I'm like, you already have Suricata built in, and now you're asking us these questions. So if we help organizations and consumers of open source do their research first, you will know what risks that you're assuming by using that open source technology.
Or at least know more of.
Right, exactly. And you get to engage with communities. You get to see a lot when you sit in these communities and you watch the dialogue and you sit on their chat channels and you go to their conferences and you meet the developers, you meet the community. It's, again, bringing that human element back into a mysterious world of open source. It's not fairy dust and unicorns.
Yeah.
And there's a chance to feed
There'll be
back
some
into the.
cookies if anybody wants cookies in open source.
Yeah, there's a question here.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so much. So Phil, one of the things you said that really resonated with me was that we all need to be better at critical thinking. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. One of the things I struggle with as a parent of both a 10 and a 7-year-old, as well as a technical lead within my organization, is encouraging my children as well as my analysts to be better critical thinkers. And one of the suggestions that was kind of touched on was pausing, right? And I actually refer to that as the power of the pause with my kids and my analysts before approaching a problem. One of the things that I struggle with, however, is it seems like everything is seeking to rob them of the opportunity of being wrong and learning from it. So my question is to you is, in that environment where you have the internet, the AI, and all these bastions of knowledge and dispensaries of knowledge, how can we better equip our youth, our analysts that we're mentoring, to be wrong and be vulnerable and develop those critical thinking skills as a result of being wrong and vulnerable and working through that?
I mean, it's a fantastic question. I mean, I'm no expert on this, so I can't even profess to be able to give a good answer to this. But just from, my kind of limited perspective, I think you're right in that the pause is the most important thing. And I think a technique that a lot of people use is just anytime you're about to do something, whether it's an email or a social media response or something, is, just this is, I kind of have a, in my desk, I have a little sticker and which literally says "stop!" ! This is the time to think. Just to remind me that kind of we're all victims of that. I think also as well is I think we all have a responsibility to design in systems and environments to encourage the ability for people to do what you're describing. I think, again, I'm no expert on this, but to give an example, in some of for example, our AI responses to things, we try and ground those responses and have a link that shows, even in some of the generative response, where people can then click the link and go find the source of which that answer was developed from. So I think it's kind of on all of us to create environments in which there's the kind of the behavioral, inducement to do those things. And we spend a lot of time doing that. Again, I wouldn't say we're perfect, but like, whether you're a healthcare company, a tech company, any small business, and not-for-profit, just thinking about what you're building and how it interacts with the people you interact with, that can just create those moments, and the ability to do what you're describing, I think, is important. And again, I'm not familiar with probably a gazillion amount of research on this topic. And, I think this, again, it comes back to kind of what you were touching on before, is the blending of some of our disciplines of security, privacy, behavioral psychology, economics, or, user interface design. I think we just need to be more kind of blended on these things.
If I can offer a suggestion as well. So the way I manage it with my CERIAS developers, particularly our junior developers, when they come in, I ask them flat out, what are you afraid of? Like, if you make a mistake, what are you afraid of? And most of the time they say, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, or I'm afraid you're going to get mad at me, or I'm afraid I'm going to, piss off someone in the community. I'm like, all right, now that we know that, let's put in some safeguards so you feel comfortable that those things won't happen. I won't fire you, so trust that I've got your back. We've got a team of developers that are going to check your work. We've got a community of people that you can reach out to and ask questions of. So we try and create as many fail-safe moments for them to say, go try. And what I'm seeing from some of my younger developers that actually started out as interns is that they are excelling, but excelling in ways that we could never have laid out for them in some sort of performance kind of mapping. They're doing it because they're curious. So I think if we remove the fear, we give them some safeguards within reason, right? They will excel in ways that we never ever expected them that they could.
If you think in general about training and human reactions, the sense of urgency is one of the primary aspects in successful phishing. Is act now or you'll lose your account, or act now or you'll have an arrest warrant issued, or whatever it is. And it encourages people who are not accustomed to thinking carefully and slowly about something. But in training, if someone's going to be a trapeze artist, you don't put them on the high trapeze for their first day. You give them some exercises that are close to the ground, and let them fall, and let them gain a sense of their balance. And the same is true with children, is you don't immediately take a 10-year-old and say, oh, you're going driving today, here, and put them in the car. You build steps, you build confidence, you build experience. Same with developers. I could say this as an educator, that we don't immediately, the first day of class, say, you're going to build a cloud system. No, that's not the right way to do it. But we have gotten away from that to some extent, as parents, as managers, as others. You should sort of banish the phrase, you should have known better, from your vocabulary, because if they did it, it's because they didn't know better. And it's up to us to provide the context and the training to try to help them learn to do things better, and to do it without the excess pressure early on. Eventually, we all are in a position of greater responsibility and sometimes have to act quickly, but we're not thrown into that at the beginning. We have to provide a ramp.
Last question in the back of the room.
Working? I'm guessing it is. Hello there. I know you can't really see me, so I'll just raise my hand in the air. Hi. My name is Swastik, and I'm studying IT and CS here at Purdue. And firstly, Kelley, Mike, and Phil, thank you so much for your time today. You mentioned earlier that people don't usually read the terms of service earlier, and honestly, if I'm being honest, I don't think I saw a single hand, including mine, raised in this room when you asked who actually reads the terms of service, which is probably not a very good thing. And also, especially in my generation and the generations coming after mine, I'm 20 years old, if that gives any indication. Attention spans are getting far worse for a variety of reasons. So we view, for example, meticulously written specifications about security as a hassle more than anything else, and that's obviously a problem. So my question is, given all of that, how can we realistically encourage and make it easier for my generation to, and the ones after mine, to care more about doing the hard thing when it comes to implementing those security specifications that you've been all talking about today into their systems when they actually get into the workforce?
I mean, the thing, perhaps my kind of obvious answer is, which I've kind of touched on before, is just better and better defaults. I mean, just all of us have to make the secure path the easier path, and just kind of make it as default, as natural as possible, because I think that exactly to your point, people are just, have never spent a lot of time doing this unless they've been given tools and defaults and other things that create an environment in which it's easier to do it right than do it wrong.
And I think customers are going to expect it. We now have a leveling up expectation around the safety and security of systems that we're using. And so build it into your product lifecycle or your software development roadmap as this is going to be expected of us. This is not something that we get to choose anymore, because our customers are going to demand it one way or another, either going in that they're going to demand it, or if something goes sideways, they're going to hold you accountable. So which one do you want to lean into, and build it from there?
And then just one thing to add to that too, you mentioned about having a hard line maybe on your cybersecurity posture and things like that, right? How do you enforce that? Or some of the challenge maybe enforcing that. Certainly, my experience is there's always a degree of variability with that. And the opportunity that I'm afforded in my role is one of helping the business make informed risk decisions. And sometimes the risk is worth taking to maybe lower a security posture or to accept maybe something that you always wouldn't accept in a pure technical context. There's always maybe where something should be from a hardening and a best practice perspective, but from a real world perspective, there's some particular functionality, there's some particular need to have to use maybe a certain kind of software or configuration that would warrant kind of lowering or a variation, or more corporately, a variation or a waiver to use that. So I would always say there's a degree of variability in how strict or how enforced something needs to be as well. So it's always something to bear in mind as well when you're either writing software or.
I'll add one last thought on this, particularly as it relates to user agreements and the like. For a very long time, those of us who work in computing, not the younger generations, but some of us who've been around for a long time, have been used to the idea that you have to have an evolved degree and a lot of experience and deeper understanding to be able to do these things. We're seeing that change, and it has been changing. We have people who are programming in Excel, for instance, and they don't have any classes in computing. And now with AI agents, it's going to be even more accessible. There are still segments, though, that have that cloistered view. Lawyers are one, that you have to be educated in the law to be able to write and understand a user agreement or a contract. And that's an area perhaps ripe for some further discussion and changes. That's where that comes from. But we are more involved with the democratization of computing and understanding of information processing. And that's going to lead to a lot of changes that we don't have time to talk about because we've reached the end of the panel session and it's time for a networking break. I'd like to thank the panel members so much for agreeing to sit for this. Thank you. And we have other sessions later after the break and 2 more keynotes tomorrow. So take a look at your agenda, meet each other. Coffee is across the hall. Restrooms are down this hall and down that hall. And thank you very much.